Now, moving on, you may have heard mutterings about Colombia's rocky road to peace, but did you know that Uncle Sam has a dog or two in that fight? Not only that, but so do multinational corporations. You know, the aforementioned people in, profit out paradigm. Here to talk more about the conflict in Colombia and what the hell it has to do with us is writer and activist Justin Podur, who also has some thoughts on social justice, the power of the people, and the path forward towards the more equal and just society that we mentioned earlier in the show. Take a look.
The peace agreement between the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC, and the government has been ratified in Congress. They approved they approved the fast track so that they can make the legislative changes they need to enact the various pieces of the peace accords that were ratified in Colombian legislation. As the process with the FARC is now is in the implementation phase. There's also the Colombia's second guerrilla group, a smaller group than the FARC, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the ELN, and they're signaling the start of a peace process there, and the FARC peace process went on for 4+ years. Arguably, it's been going on for decades because there's a peace process and it breaks down, but this one really looks different to people who have studied the history. But the ELN is now starting to talk about a peace process as well.
Talk about the U.S. role, and I mean a lot of people are familiar, or some people are familiar with Allende in 1973 or Argentina in 1976, but the U.S. involvement in Colombia is a little less known overtly, and also on top of that, what does this peace process mean for U.S.-Colombia relations?
So the Colombian Civil War, so to speak, and I mean, again, any of these words is disputed. I have friends in Colombia who have argued that it's not fair to call it a civil war precisely because there's so many external interests, especially the United States, mainly really the United States, but and it's more of a war against civilians. This was one of the phrases that I used to hear a lot. It's not a civil war, it's a war against civilians. But the Civil War, if I'll allow myself to call it that, can be traced either to 1964 when the FARC was formally formed, or to 1948, which was when a progressive presidential candidate named Gaitan was assassinated, and there was a war between his party, the Liberals, and the Conservatives. And those liberal guerrillas, decades later, became the core of the FARC. So this has been going on a really long time. And the strategy that the United States adopted to deal with progressive challenges to the economic model of concentrated wealth and specifically in Colombia concentrated land, that peasants in Colombia were demanding land reform and changes to the way that the wealth was distributed, right? So, socialism, communism, communist parties were arising. The Cuban Revolution happened in 1959. There were armed struggles all in many, maybe most Latin American countries along those same lines as FARC and ELN. There were armed struggles in Venezuela and Guatemala and El Salvador, all over. Brazil, and the U.S. response to this was one for which Colombia was a real model for the whole region, and the response had to do with the paramilitary strategy. In Colombia, in order to they managed to maintain a democratic parliamentary system with elections while simultaneously so it wasn't a military dictatorship ever, but at the same time, they sent these armed forces into the countryside to crush the rebels and to attack peasants and to terrorize them. And these forces did the same thing in the cities. They attacked union leaders and women's groups and anybody that was seeking kind of progressive change in the cities. And that these were not formally part of the army, but everybody knows and understands that they are armed and trained and interactive with the army. And so the paramilitarism was the U.S. contribution to this conflict
Is
in
this at
from
all
the
tied into the School of Americas?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. So the School of Americas is a school in Georgia at Fort Benning, but it's really more of a network by which they bring the U.S. brings officers from all around the world, but in this case for the School of the Americas, all over the Americas, and that's what facilitates these connections between military officers and of all of these countries and the U.S.
So just to clear, the U.S. is not a fan of the peace deal either because of that, the paramilitaries and the money.
Yeah, so I mean, there are opportunities on both sides in terms of peace and war. So like, if you understand it in terms of a divided elite in Colombia, and part of it is represented by Uribe and these landlords that don't want to give up any land and they don't want to give up anything in order to have peace. And the war economy works for them, the paramilitarism works for them, the ability uh, to say that any peaceful challenge is actually guerrilla movement in disguise, that really works for them. On the other hand, part of the elite, represented by the current president, Santos, wants Colombia to be a normal country. They don't want kidnappings. They don't want people to be afraid to go in the countryside. They want Colombia to be open for business in that sense, like real multinational, like middle income kind of capitalism. So that's a conflict, and I think that also does exist in the U.S. Civil War. So
So talk about that a little bit because
sure.
you have talked about this the the issue of capitalism and the corporatocracy. Talk about that role in Colombia and in particular like these multinational corporations also working with the paramilitary or working to destabilize the country.
In Colombia, there's particularly good documentation of key industries and specific corporations like British Petroleum. If you look up British Petroleum and paramilitarism in Colombia, or if you look up Coca-Cola bottling plants and the way that union organizers were, many union organizers were murdered in these Coca-Cola bottling plants. So there's attacks on unions. There's protection money paid to paramilitaries, sometimes to the guerrillas too. There's Chiquita banana. So there's a whole other story of banana workers being totally, under siege and attacked and murdered, and union organizers there being under particular attack. And if you look at the pattern, so Colombia has one of the most one of the highest internally displaced people. So millions and millions of people who lived in the countryside and are now displaced. They live now in cities, street selling or in other parts of the country than where they were forced to flee from. So they were forced to flee by paramilitaries, usually most of the time, massacres, threats of massacres, and so on. And this was all part of the war. But if you look at the areas they fled from, a lot of those areas now are under the control of extractive industry. It's actually a land grab by these corporations. And that's been one of the main outcomes of the war. And that's also one of the main things that these elites don't want to give up. They don't want to have to give any of that land back in order to have the peace. And there is some land reform built into the agreement. So those are some examples of the way that corporations have profited from the war, like specifically through land grabs, the destruction of opposition, potential union organizers or peasant organizers, or indigenous people whose territories have been taken up, Afro-Colombians whose territories have been taken over. And then there's also the whole export of the paramilitary strategy. So Colombian paramilitaries popped up in Honduras after the coup. They're playing a role in Venezuela. There have been numerous plots against the government involving Colombian paramilitaries. So they've played a role beyond Colombia because Colombia has been this kind of laboratory for paramilitarism.
Do you feel that there's a difference between the US, or really this sort of idea of like a global empire, and global capitalism, or does one feed the other? Are they separate, or is it really just one entity that is a corporatocratic imperial entity?
Yeah, my analysis is definitely that the military strategies um, uh, are are employed to empower the those that are already the wealthiest and most powerful. And that actually, I think, is a big part of why the FARC ultimately decided to sign the peace agreement. And that's why the civil resistance, or the social movements in Colombia, were encouraging the 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 idea of a negotiated peace, because their argument was, as long as we're a party to a war is always going to serve the other side. In this context that we live in, war is always going to serve the business, and it's never going to serve the people.
Going a little bit further with that, because I know that you wrote a book about the Zapatista movement, Demands of the Dead, and like in the context of your research, and particularly what we've seen in Colombia, or even in places like North Dakota, this sort of resistance by the indigenous, by the
Yeah.
poor, by the most at risk and the most oppressed.
Hmm.
What do you see? Like, talk a little bit about these resistance movements and what we might also be able to learn from these indigenous or oppressed
Hmm.
movements.
Yeah, exactly. So in Colombia, I learned a lot from the indigenous, one specific indigenous, I guess, in Canada we would call them a First Nation, but like the Nasa of Northern Cauca. And their struggle goes back to the 19th century, and they also had these conversations about whether to have an armed struggle or not. They had an armed group called the guerrillas of Manuel Quintil-Lame, who was a figure from their own history in the 19th century. But so they had a guerrilla army armed struggle for a while. They stopped it because their reading of the conditions was that. And the Zapatistas are very similar, right? Like they were able to be so sophisticated in when they had when they used force, when they used the threat of force, and when they absolutely don't use force. And so it was kind of like the way the Zapatistas always put it is, we had the guns so that people would listen. When people are listening, we don't need them anymore.
You include quotes on your site, and I think one of them in particular, as I was reading through, seemed very timely. By Arundhati Roy, fascism itself can only be turned away if all those who are outraged by it show a commitment to social justice that equals the intensity of their indignation. So finally, with that in mind, talk a little bit about like what we're, and not just we as Americans or
Yeah.
U.S. citizens, but we as a people on this planet, we as the 99, what we're up against right now, and more about that path forward.
So what I really liked about that was not Arundhati's emphasis on like commitment or conviction, but really the specific words social justice. Because what she's talking about there is, what I understand it to be is like that commitment to, like you were saying, the 99, that commitment to the poor and the oppressed uh, has to be there in this kind of fight with fascism. And honestly, like when I saw what I see happening right now in the States, where like there's so many things that are in serious danger with Trump's election, and the fact that the Democratic leadership that should be the opposition to all this is focusing primarily on trying to start a war with Russia as their strategy is really, really disappointing. Let's
Don't trust Democrats, don't trust
yeah.
Republicans, basically
Yeah,
is the yeah.
that's what it is.
For more on Justin's work, visit Podur.org. His site is a wealth of information on subjects ranging from Colombia and Venezuela to environmentalism to Israel, Palestine, and Middle East politics in general. His writing is not only highly insightful and content-rich, but it highlights the links between all of these issues, indeed between the various struggles of the 99%.